Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another webinar organized by the Hashim Sani Centre for Palestine Studies. We have our guest tonight, Professor Saul Takahashi, who is talking from Abu Dhabi. And many of you are familiar with Professor Saul Takahashi, who is a professor of human rights. And now he is based in Abu Dhabi, but may not be for long, but that is another matter. Uh, but tonight we'll be discussing about the ceasefire in between the US and Iran, as well as the latest developments in West Asia and also the situation in Gaza. So thank you, Saul, for your kind willingness to talk to us. So
Always,
my
always a pleasure. Thank you.
okay. So my first question to you is, um, there is supposed to be a ceasefire, and we know the reason is because Trump realized that American public, they are not behind his war at all. They think it's a mistake, so he wants to get out. Um, but at the moment, Iran is imposing some conditions, right? Saying that Washington must waive all sanctions and release their funds because some of their money, I can't remember exactly how much, couple of billions are being frozen. And if and also about the situation in Lebanon, right? Because Iran said that Israel must not attack what the Lebanese, South Lebanese, as well as they must get out basically from Lebanon. And which is Israel said they are not going to do that. So my question to you is: do you think this ceasefire is going to last, or is it going to be very temporary?
Hmm. Well, of course, that's the million-dollar question, and we're all looking and waiting to see what's really going to happen. Look, I mean, the thing is, there's been a lot of commentary about what's happening in the Straits of Hormuz and, what sort of implications that's going to have. And, every other day or so, Trump has another childish outburst on social media, and he threatens to destroy Iran's civilization and this, that, and the other. And then the next day, when the markets come back up, then all of a sudden, everything's fine. And so it's very difficult to follow what's going on. But the fact of the matter is, um, both Iran and the United States want some sort of agreement. That's the fact of it. So I personally am not so concerned about each and everything that happens in the Straits of Hormuz. There's been a lot of commentary every now and then, the Iranians do something or they don't do something, and the Americans attack and, this kind of thing. There's all this stuff that's going on, but because the overall attitude of both sides with regards to the Straits of Hormuz and with regards to the agreement in general is that they want the war to end and they want to come to an agreement, and they pretty much want this agreement to work. So I'm not so concerned about that. But what I am concerned about, and what I think, people should be much more concerned about is, as you rightly pointed out, is Lebanon, because the Israelis do not want any kind of agreement between the US and Iran. The Israelis do not want the war to end. They don't want the shooting to end. They want perpetual war, and they want the US to basically invade Iran. They want this war to continue and to fight to the last American. That's what the Israelis want. So they've been doing their utmost to sabotage the ceasefire and any kind of agreement between the US and Iran. And, that's really the picture here. Now, the other thing is, because because the US remains so subservient to Israeli interests, with this illegal war of aggression on Iran would never have happened if it weren't for Israel to begin with. The Israelis tricked Trump into it. And I think he's actually really pissed off about that. But the fact of the matter is, the American political elite are so subservient to Israeli interests. I mean, you even go so far as to say they're almost, being controlled by Israel. That what's happening now with Lebanon is they are pushing towards frameworks that will remove basically Lebanon from the equation of the framework between the US and Iran. So, the MOU between the US and Iran states pretty clearly that Israel must respect Lebanese sovereignty and they have to stop all military activity in Lebanon. And, that's pretty clear. But then just maybe a week or so later, there was this big, quote unquote, trilateral framework between the Lebanese and the Israelis and the Americans that was signed in Washington. And then all of a sudden, everything is completely different. Then all of a sudden, Iran is being excluded from the picture. And Lebanese sovereignty is somehow conditional. And Israel, it turns out, does not have to leave southern Lebanon. It can continue to do whatever it wants. So this is the kind of thing that Israel is pushing, and the Americans basically are all too happy to oblige. So that this really could lead to a breakdown in the MOU and in a resumption of hostilities. The other thing that I think the Americans are trying to do is a way of placating the Israelis is I think their end game, Trump's end game in particular, is strong arming Lebanon into joining the Abraham Accords. I think they are, they're thinking they're going to push Lebanon into basically normalizing diplomatic relations with the Israelis, and that would be really bad because you don't normalize relations with a country that's committing genocide and that's illegally occupying your territory. I mean, this is utterly outrageous. So far they haven't been successful, but the Lebanese government is very, very vulnerable. So we have to see. I very much hope that it's not going to go that way, but it is very precarious. I think there's a lot of attention towards the Straits of Hormuz, but really what we have to be focusing on is Lebanon and what the Israelis are doing.
Okay. But having said that, there are also factions apparently in Iran who are also not happy with the ceasefire that they think that they should continue to fight the Americans because the Americans were the one who committed the crime in the first place to attack them, and they should be punished and in a weak position. So some Iranians or I think elements in the Revolutionary Guards say that they should continue the war, right? So do you think that is going to influence Iran about to maybe abandon the ceasefire?
Well, I think the Iranian government as a whole doesn't want to do that. But of course, there are, very hardline factions within Iran, just as there are very hardline factions in the United States. And, it never fails to amaze me how when, the US media, the so-called international media, and I'm not including, Al Jazeera or for example, TRT in that pool, but when you look at the Western controlled media, they present Iran as this monolith of crazed lunatics. And they've been jumping on these kind of reports and really highlighting them to show how the Iranians are, bloodthirsty warmongers. But the fact of the matter is, they're just, they are just pointing to the fact that Iran is, in many ways, is a democratic country. There's it's a very complex political system, and there is democratic representation in a lot of levels. Arguably, in some ways, parts of the Iranian system are more democratic than the United States. So, I mean, of course, it's a complex country, and there are people who are who feel that Iran is giving too much through this MOU, and they feel that they should continue the war. But I don't think, the government as a totality doesn't really want to do that because they understand that, look, Iran has suffered. There's been a lot of not just military damage, of course, but economic damage and a lot of loss of civilian life. The Americans and Israelis, of course, have certainly have not shied away from attacking civilian objects and massacring civilians. This is really the Gazification of armed conflict as a whole that we have been seeing. The Israeli model of complete and total destruction of absolute, of slaughter of any kind of not just civilians themselves, but destruction of civilian infrastructure necessary for sustaining life, destruction of cultural artifacts and cultural facilities, destruction of history. This is the Israeli model of armed conflict, and it always has been, but it's just got much more overt and much more in your face since October 2023. And now they're doing the same thing in Lebanon. And to a certain extent, they've also been doing that kind of thing in Iran. It's just they couldn't, get to that point quite yet. So, this is, the Iran has suffered, and I think Iran feels that it's time to stop shooting. They have a very good hand. They've basically won the conflict. They've won the war. I mean, that's very clear. It's hilarious watching some of these people like Rubio and Vance try to sort of explain away what's clear to everybody that America has lost, and the agreement that America has basically signed on to is pretty much everything that Iran wanted. We'll see if it really works out that way. I very much don't want to see a return to armed conflict, and I don't think anybody does, or anybody in their right mind should. But it's clear that America has lost this war. It's clear that this has been a strategic catastrophe for the United States. And we'll see what that means for the international order as a whole. But I do think, both the Americans and the Iranians, both the governments do want this agreement to work.
I also read recently that J.D. Vance made a very strong statement against some Israeli politicians, some Israeli leaders who were attacking Trump, right? Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, they were criticizing, and probably, in fact, I think they were using harsh words
I
against
think
Trump as
so.
well. And J.D. Vance then said that you should realize that you cannot survive without America or something like that. It
Yes.
seems that so is this trend going to strengthen in the sense that the Americans are going to be more upset against towards Israel, and then may change their policy in the future in the long run? Do you see a trend here?
Well, in the long run, yes. In the long run, the trend is very, very clear. There's no question about that. Even before October 2023, the trends were very clear. I mean, the young people in America are getting sick of Israel. They're getting sick of this ridiculous control that Israel has over American foreign policy. They're sick and tired of America going to war for Israel. And they're sick, of course, of the crimes against humanity that Israel commits with abandon. And the long-term trend has been very clear even before October 2023. Now, since October 2023, of course, it's just been exacerbated. In particular the young people, but not just the young people. I mean, if you look at the opinion polls, now the majority of supporters of the Democratic Party sympathize more with the Palestinians than they do with the Israelis. And in particular, the young people in particular, are just utterly repulsed by the wanton savagery and brutality that Israel exhibits. So that has been going on, and the writing has been on the wall for a long time, and it's just got more and more clear now, since the illegal war of aggression on Iran, that revulsion with Israel and that anger towards Israel has really got mainstream in the United States, and that is I think it's a very positive trend, I would say, for the United States, for Palestine, and in general, because look, it is so blatantly clear what happened. Even newspapers like the New York Times have published exposés on this. Basically, the Israelis tricked Trump. They cheated Trump. They tricked him into getting on the bandwagon of this war, tricking him and lying to him, saying it's going to end in 72 hours, and all this kind of nonsense, figuring that they would drag him in, and once he was in, he wouldn't be able to stop the war easily. And they were right. I mean, he was continuing on for over a month, even when it was very clear that it was a disaster. So, and this is very clear. And you have very prominent figures in the MAGA movement. I mean, Carlson is just one, but very prominent figures in the MAGA movement have been very vocal about this. They supported Trump precisely because Trump said, "End to forever wars, end to fighting wars of other countries, mainly Israel, but also the Europeans." And basically, America's always had this streak where they retreat from the outside world, and they have this inward looking sort of streak that comes out at certain periods of the history. It was like this for a while after between World War I and World War II, for example. So that's one of the main driving forces behind the MAGA movement. And so people are angry. They should be angry. And it really is pathetic how you have this alleged superpower, militarily, economically, completely dominant over the entire globe, and less and less by the day. But still, you have this inward-looking streak on the part of the United States, and that was one of the main driving forces behind the MAGA movement. And it is utterly pathetic. Already in the days of I think it was Bill Clinton who after a meeting with Netanyahu, he went back to his aides and said, "Look, which one of us is the superpower here?" And it really is, it's a situation where, a lot of people have said a lot of things about this, the wag the dog and, all that kind of stuff. But it's really pathetic how the American foreign policy elite seems to be controlled by the state of Israel. And it's really came out very clearly on this occasion. Now, apparently Trump had harsh words for Netanyahu. Vance, made that statement. All this has been reported on, and all of this has been, people have got a little bit excited about this. But frankly, yeah, I mean, talk is cheap. And let's not forget that also during the genocide is still ongoing, but the overt live stream genocide in Gaza, there was at least one occasion when this kind of thing happened, and people were saying, "Oh, now all of a sudden there's a big rift between Trump and Netanyahu, and things are going to change." But it seems like it was staged. Now, whether I don't think that it's being staged this time around, but whether this is going to translate to concrete policy in the immediate term, I'm a little bit skeptical because so far, not really much has happened. I mean, Trump seems to have sort of bashed Netanyahu on the head about Lebanon, or at least about bombing Beirut. But the fact of the matter is, he's still allowing Netanyahu to occupy the southern part of Lebanon. The massacres continue unabated in Lebanon. So, the Americans
Yeah.
are allowing that. And when we talk about Palestine, remember, with all this focus on Iran and a little bit less focus on Lebanon, Palestine has really dropped away from the radar of the international media. And that's a very serious issue. That's really problematic. Since the ceasefire, this Trump, this American imposed ceasefire of October last year, over 1,000 Gazans have been massacred by the Israelis. The Israelis have never stopped firing. Yes, it's a little bit of a lower level than it was for those 2 years. But the genocide has not stopped. Humanitarian aid is still being blocked. So, this is not stopping. And it's important that we remember that. And it's important that we don't allow these agreements, with Lebanon and the stuff with the board of peace and all. Israel is being presented as some kind of legitimate security partner whose, interests we have to take into account and are all paramount. No, Israeli occupation of Palestine has been deemed illegal by the ICJ. The UN General Assembly has decided that Israel has to leave. In fact, that deadline has come and passed. This was in September of last year, and nothing has happened. So, I think it's important that we continue to call for accountability for Israeli crimes against humanity, and that we continue to pursue criminal responsibility and the responsibility of the state of Israel. It's very important.
Yeah. And that guy, Nikolai Mladinov, from the Bulgarian
Hmm.
guy who's in charge of the Board of Peace, I think the so-called Board of Peace, he is insisting that all the Palestinians in Gaza must surrender all their weapons, including rifles, complete surrender of their weapons uh, before um, uh, before what they can talk about ceasefire or to continue the ceasefire.
Yes.
And but Hamas is saying that the Israelis must withdraw from Gaza first. So it seems that there's actually a deadlock. And Nikolai Mladinov is basically acting on behalf of Israel, it seems, rather than trying to be a peacemaker. What do you think of it?
Well, unfortunately, he's not going to be the first senior UN official that is basically acting as an advocate for Israel. And this is an ongoing problem with, with the United Nations. Obviously, Mladenov is not in the UN anymore. He left his position, and then I think he was working for, I think it might have been the Tony Blair Institute. I can't exactly remember, but he was in the UAE for a while. And now here he is. He's heading he's the head sort of top civil servant, if you like, of the Board of Peace. But this is not what the ceasefire agreement says. I mean, the ceasefire agreement is very clear that there is going to be a staged, a staggered sort of process whereby the Palestinians do certain things, the Israelis do certain things, and it goes step by step. And now all of a sudden the goalposts have shifted. And again, this is just another sad, outrageous example of how the goalposts are being shifted with regards to the Palestinians. The Israelis come to the table, say they will agree to A, B, and C, and then all of a sudden the agreements get thrown in the bin, and all of a sudden, oh no, 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 all of this is completely conditional on the Palestinians surrendering unconditionally. That's really what it is. So, we have this deadlock here, and there really has to be much more outrage about this at the international level. The whole the whole fact that the Board of Peace, so-called Board of Peace, got was given the mandate to essentially to govern Gaza for 2 years by the Security Council. This is a day that should live in infamy in the history of the international community as a whole and the UN in particular. This is just another betrayal of Palestinian rights by the United Nations, the member states of the United Nations. And it really is an outrage that this is where we are now. So, this mustn't be normalized. This is not okay. And unfortunately, with the illegal war of aggression on Iran and what's happening in Lebanon, also another illegal war of aggression, of course, the international focus on Gaza has sort of it's not there right now. Gaza, not to mention the West Bank, of course, because the colonization of the West Bank has never stopped. It's continued nonstop since 1967. That's the fact of it. The fact of it is that every single Israeli political leader since 67, well, I mean, the International Criminal Court didn't exist at the time, but basically, since the early 2000s, when Palestine became a member state of the International Criminal Court, every single Israeli political leader should be indicted on war crimes because colonization of Palestine is a war crime. It's very clear. So, this is just another example of the betrayal of Palestinian rights. And this is why, things have to change, really.
Yeah. So, but unfortunately, some countries, including Muslim countries, Pakistan, Indonesia, I think they actually say that they want to participate in this board of peace, and Indonesia said that they wanted to contribute soldiers to the force. This is actually betrayal of the Palestinian cause, right? To be part of
Well,
that plan. Yeah.
look, I mean, I certainly think it is. I mean, sorry. I mean, I certainly think it's a betrayal. Yes. You know, one of the uh, one of the very strong narratives that you have in governments and also in the UN civil service, is that politics is the art of the possible. We have to deal with the real life situation and not with idealistic, sunshine and rainbow kind of notions. And so, this is what we're faced with. Several countries, so I understand, basically justified their acceptance of the Board of Peace and some their representation on the Board of Peace with some countries, basically saying that, look, this is the best way to make sure the United States remains engaged, or this is the only way, really. Yeah, we could storm out, but then what's going to happen? The Israelis are going to go back to massacring women and children every day. So this is the best way. This is the only practical solution that there is. I'm not a UN civil servant anymore, and I've never been a government official. So I have the luxury of being able to say, look, this is a betrayal. But I do feel that way. And, the problem is, when you start compromising your principles or compromising the principles, then it never ends. And we see this is what happened. I mean, look, these, states have agreed to join the Board of Peace. It seems like none of them have shelled out this, what is it, $1 billion that Trump is
Yeah.
demanding, probably going to go to his pocket. But, they have joined and they have, some of them have suggested, yeah, look, this is the only way. But what's happened? Nothing good has come of it. So at a certain point, even if you sort of compromise at the beginning, I think at a certain point, states have to say, look, nothing good has come of this. We are basically, we're basically going with the whitewash and going with the suppression of Palestinian rights, and we're just not going to take it anymore. So they should kick over the bin and leave, I think. I have to say, I am disappointed with Indonesia's announcement. It was pretty early on that that they were interested in sending troops to the ISF, this security force that Trump had, dreamed up, at the beginning, because this security force I mean, it's unspeakably outrageous. I mean, it is an unspeakable, it is an unspeakable outrage because the whole idea is that the ISF, and I think when Trump dreamed it up at the beginning, he thought it would be the Gulf nations or the Moroccans or whatever. I mean, he can't tell the difference. But the point is the point is the idea here is that okay, we have the Board of Peace that's run by Trump and his cronies. This is going to facilitate big time real estate development deals that is going to enrich Trump, his family, and their buddies. And the ISF that's going to be the enforcement force. They're the ones that are going to forcibly disarm Hamas. They're the ones that are going to keep the Palestinians in line. And they're going to be the muscle, like with any kind of mafia scheme, the ISF is going to be the muscle. So what this means is you're going to have Muslim killing Muslim, Muslim fighting Muslim, while Trump and Netanyahu sip martinis in the newly created Trump casino in Gaza. That was the idea here. And it really is, it's a big disappointment to me, yes, that any Muslim nation would agree to this. Now, the only I won't call it good news, but the only sort of relatively positive thing about this as it stands now is that nothing's happened. And like you mentioned, Mladenov has not been able to really sort of get things going, and obviously Hamas is not playing. They're not just raising their arms and throwing down their weapons. This is not going to happen. So nothing has happened, but nothing positive has happened either. Like I mentioned before, the Israelis continue to slaughter women and children. They continue to bomb, displaced people's camps, and they continue to prevent humanitarian aid from getting into Gaza at anything, approaching adequate levels.
And
So, the genocide is continuing, and the International Criminal Court and the international community at large really has to, get on the ball here. It's positive that Netanyahu and Gallant have, international arrest warrants issued against them, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. And really,
yeah,
those arrest warrants are also, in my mind, being an academic and not being, tied to any kind of government or any kind of, civil service or international organization, I have the freedom to say that the arrest warrants are completely inadequate. They don't have genocide. They don't have charges of genocide, and that, those really have to be added to these arrest warrants.
And in the meantime, Nikolai Vladimov hasn't said anything. No comment about Israel's occupation of 70%, sorry, 60% now of the land, and planning to go to
Yes.
increase to 70% apparently, and no criticism, comment whatsoever from Vladimov. Right? That shows how what one-sided it is as far as he is concerned.
Yeah.
Anyway, but the good news is that the recent primaries, Democratic primaries, New York, where
Yes.
three politicians, three candidates won. Those are anti-AIPAC's candidates, right? Can you explain to us all the significance of what happened, the primaries?
Well, of course, it is very significant that this has been going on. I mean, this took place in New York. So the Democratic primaries, basically, they decide on the who is going to be the Democratic candidate. So it's first a sort of round of infighting, if you like, internal elections that's voted on by the Democrat, people who are registered as Democrats. And what happened was basically the candidates that stood up for justice for Palestine and stood up against AIPAC and the Israeli lobby and all of these fascist actors, they basically swept the board. So that was, of course, that's very positive, and it's very, it shows again what we were talking about before. The writing is very much on the wall. There's the popular revulsion against Israel and its crimes against humanity, against the Palestinians, against Lebanese. It's unchecked and unfettered illegal aggression against countries all throughout the Middle East. And it's blatant control of the political process in the United States. People are just really disgusted by this. So, it's good. These are Democratic primaries, but because they took place in New York, which is a very solid Democrat state, what that means is those people will no doubt come the midterm elections, they will be voted into, I think, into Congress. I think it was the House of Representatives. But the thing is, and a lot of people have sort of again lost their focus on this issue. But we mustn't forget, I think the 2026 midterm elections in the United States will take place. The Trump and his cronies have done their utmost to restrict the ability of a lot of minorities to vote and to suppress the vote in a lot of Democrat run constituencies. But they haven't really had the time to do this in a complete manner. So it's going to take place. And even with all of those suppression measures, I gather the Democrats are going to have a really good day in November 2026. But look, 2028, the presidential elections, I'm still very skeptical that there are going to be elections. I really don't think that is the plan. I think the plan of Trump and his fascistic cronies is not to hold elections. They are going to, declare some kind of bogus national emergency, like they've done, at the drop of a hat every other week since Trump has come back to office. And they're going to try to cancel the elections. This is what they're going to do. Americans really have to wake up, smell the coffee, and realize that American exceptionalism in terms of democratic institutions is just complete bunk. We've seen corporations, law firms, the Supreme Court in many cases, though certainly not all cases, the judiciary, the executive, bend the knee instinctively to Trump and his motley crew of fascists. This is the reality, I mean, really we are looking at fascism in the United States. That's really what we're looking at. So I'm not so optimistic about what's going to happen in 2028. But let's see. I mean, 2026, certainly the Democrats, I think, are going to have a good day, and then we'll see what they're going to do. Will they impeach Trump? They should. Will they, work to prevent each and everything that he and his band of fascists are trying to do? They should. But again, looking at what a lot of the mainstream Democrats have been doing, they have been weak, limp-wristed people, and they haven't fought against what's happening in any kind of serious way in most cases. So, the vote in those primaries, what took place in New York is first of all, it's a protest against, the Republicans, a protest against AIPAC, it's against Israel, but it's also against the Democratic mainstream. And, we mustn't forget it, the mainstream or the leaders, the leadership of the Democratic Party, most of them were staunchly against the candidates that won the vote. They are just as controlled by the Israel lobby as the Republicans are. So, this is a protest vote against them, and I very much hope that the Democratic leadership is also going to be booted out very quickly, so that that they can get on the ball and support what the public really wants, and that is a much more stricter approach towards Israel in general and Palestine in particular.
All right. Thank you, Saul. I think we've run out of time. That was,
Thank you.
even though there were mixed pictures, but nevertheless, the trend towards isolating or going against the Israeli lobby, against the Zionist lobby in the US is getting stronger and stronger. Trump may
Inshallah.
also, Trump apparently and JD Vance and the Republican Party has elements within the Republican Party are also beginning to, uh, well, I don't know how to say, very, very angry at the Israeli lobby, and they may also change their policy in the future. So
Inshallah.
overall, even though the Zionists are still in control, but the trend is that they are going to lose their control in the long run anyway. Maybe
Yes,
in
for
not
sure.
so long, hopefully, inshallah, so that
Inshallah.
so that we will see changes, and therefore, once the U.S. policy changes and they refuse to support Israeli brutalities in Palestine, inshallah, that will be the end of Zionism in Palestine, inshallah ta'ala.
Inshallah. Inshallah ta'ala.
Thank you very much again, Saul.
Thanks
Inshallah.
very much. Thanks very much.
Hope to talk to you again one day.
Okay,
Okay,
great. See you.
bye.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Inshallah.